Welcome to the Ancient Paths Podcast, a journey of unlearning to learn the New Testament church, where we look at what we've learned or experienced and hold it up to the light of Scripture and stories of the New Testament and early church, then discover together how we can return to those ancient paths so the church would thrive and live again. I'm Daniel Sabo, and I'm honored to be your host. Well, today's a little bit of a different podcast recording for us. I have the honor of interviewing someone who just meeting today, but have already been just really profoundly impacted by his work. And such an honor to have you with us, David Bercot, author of A Dictionary of Early Christian Beliefs and some other writings too. We're going to have the links and everything to our to his material on our podcast and on our YouTube, social media, and everything. But David, thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure, Dan. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So I'd love just to kind of start with hearing your story. I mean, to write a book like that you don't wake up one morning and decide to write a book like that. There's got to be a journey that gets you there. And so tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so it's probably a bit unusual in most people's journey. I started off, both my wife and I, as Jehovah's Witnesses. We were raised as Jehovah's Witnesses. Um, we left when we were both 26 years old. And then, started a journey to find out what is the historic faith, where is the true church, where are God's people, and that's been a long journey. So from there, we were attending an evangelical church. In the background, I was going to college because Jehovah's Witnesses don't encourage you to go to college; they discourage it
Oh, okay.
strongly. So I started college and then went on to law school. So instead of pursuing theology, um, which is my great love, I went into law for a living, but it freed me to do the kind of research I've been doing. So, um, the big step from there, the evangelical church, we were greatly blessed. I mean, wonderful people, wonderful pastor, um, was just a giant leap into Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah.
And, but there were, I don't know, some nagging questions. After the experience of growing up as a Jehovah's Witness and being taught, okay, this is what the faith is, this is, the truth, etc. I had made the resolve I was never again going to just accept somebody's word, some pastor, some writer, whoever it was, that, okay, this is it, and you have to accept it. So, um, as much as I was blessed by the church I was going to, there were some questions in my mind, and if this steps on any toes, I apologize. I'm not, that's not my intention. But probably the biggest question on my mind was eternal security, once saved, always saved. And maybe that's something you embrace, Dan. I don't even know. So I should have asked you before
No, it's
before we
okay.
start.
We don't have to agree to have a great conversation. So I'm
Y-
excited to hear your perspective.
Yeah. So the Bible seemed to say one thing to me, and well, by that time we had a different pastor than the one that had initially been there, and he was much more by the book. Dallas Theological Seminary, and he said, no, this is the historic faith. They've always Christians always believe once saved, always saved, and I thought, well, if that's the truth, then I need to embrace that. I saw the great error that Charles Russell, who started Jehovah's Witnesses, this idea of, this was in the 1870s in his case, of imagining that, oh, I've just discovered Christianity. Everyone has been wrong for 1800 years, and now I've really discovered the truth. And of course, he's only one of
Yeah, many.
hundreds or
Yeah.
thousands who have done the same thing. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I want to know and I want to embrace the historic faith. And if that's once saved, always saved, great, or whatever. There were other questions I had. But like I say, I didn't want to take somebody's word. I wanted to really know. And so I had been aware, I think, from the time I was a teenager, that we had writings from early Christians who were not that long after the apostles. I mean, I was always seeing them quoted. I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses quote them sometimes. Evangelicals, quoted them. I noticed, a lot of people quote them,
Do you
and
do
I
you
never
remember
read
some of
them.
the ones, that at that time you had at least a little bit of context from some of those names?
Yeah, a little bit, but not a lot. I just was familiar with the names like Tertullian, Justin Martyr.
Okay, yeah.
I'd heard of them, Origin, a few like that, but I'd never read them. I'd just seen these proof
Yeah,
text
their
quotes.
name and a little
Yeah, and they're easy to prove. I mean, if the scriptures are easy to prove text, huh, the early Christians, because they're much more voluminous.
Yeah. So you're seeing bits and pieces of some of these early church, writers, their little statements, but, uh, what's the greater context? You hadn't had yet a chance to kinda read the wholeness of what they're writing, just seeing these little clips and things from that point.
Right. So I had, I guess, from both college and my law studies, I saw the great need to go to primary sources. Depending on secondary sources, you would never do it as a lawyer. You would not depend on a legal encyclopedia, even though they're written by attorneys. You go to the actual cases from the appellate courts. You read the actual cases. I mean, boy, that was pounded in our heads in law school. You don't depend on a secondary source. And so I thought, I need to bite the bullet and just read these guys for myself. So I ordered a set of the Ante-Nicene Fathers. Back then it was $100, so it wasn't too expensive. It's 10 volumes. I spent a year. Um, I still was working, but um, I took him to the law office. If I didn't have a client, if I had a spare moment, I would just read. I would come home at lunch and read. My wife would bring me a sandwich. I'd come home at night, maybe spend an hour with the children. It wasn't a great time for the best time for family time, but I didn't let the family go. But I would read every night until midnight or beyond, and I
Wow.
kept doing this day after day. Now, it was difficult getting in them because, did I see a lot of things that went against stuff that I believed. I
Yeah.
mean, stepped on my toes all over the place. And at first, well, it happened several times. I thought, no, this is just too different. Something's wrong. I just, put them back on the shelf, and it's like, okay, that's it. I'm not going to read any further. But then I got to thinking, I don't have to believe what these guys believed,
Right.
and I owe it to myself to at least know
Yeah.
what they believed back then. So I kept reading, and I started it. At first, it's a lot of things seemed strange, but as I kept reading, I did see a continuity between the writers. They were saying very similar things. And so one night, instead of reading them, I just took the New Testament and read the whole thing. I read Matthew and John. I didn't read Luke and Mark. But other than that, I read all the way to the end of Revelation. I don't know what time I went to bed, but yeah, I read it all in one sitting. Um, and it was amazing to me. All these things that are right there in the New Testament, I'd never noticed. They'd always been explained away. And these were things the early Christians were taking seriously, literally. And it's like, I realized everything they were saying was the most literal, obvious interpretation of the New Testament.
Yeah.
So that gave me a really renewed interest, to continue on. And it got so exciting. I mean, it was like reading a long mystery novel that I just couldn't wait to get back
Yeah.
into it. And then when I finished them, I went on because I was thinking, well, what happened? If this is what they believed before the Council of Nicaea, what happened? And so I got the next set of the Nicene and post Nicene writers, and I didn't read them completely like I did the ante-Nicene Fathers, but I read quite a lot of those writings of people, John Chrysostom, Athanasius, Augustine, a lot of those people in that century and a little beyond. And then I skipped through most of the Middle Ages and then read Luther, Calvin. I read their own writings. Menno Simons, who was with the Anabaptists, just trying to figure out, okay, did anyone pick this strain up? What where did all this disappear? And so then after a year plus of reading, I I told the family. I mean, it convicted me. I mean, it nothing. That was one of the major change points in my life. It was like before I started reading them. I mean, I was a Sunday school teacher in our church. I was respected as somebody who was a decent, maybe not model, but whatever Christian. I mean, I think highly respected. And I realized if I lived back in the second century, I would be viewed as a backslidden, weak, watered down
Wow.
Christian. And I the conviction for me was this is not acceptable to God. I have got to change my life. And not that I had anything overtly wicked going on. It was just lots of things. I definitely loved the world a lot more than Christians back then. Um, I saw my my profession. I had to think. Fortunately, I was not a trial lawyer, but I did file a lot of lawsuits against people. I was an oil and gas attorney, um, and sometimes there would be issues about royalties and all of that. And I saw the early Christians, they took the Sermon on the Mount so literally, that, yeah, they wouldn't take someone to court. Not just their brother they wouldn't take to court, they wouldn't take their neighbor to court, and I thought,
Wow.
wow, yeah, would Christ do what I'm doing? I'm not saying it condemning other attorneys or anything. I'm just saying what convicted me in my life. So I decided, yeah, that was going to have to end. And like I say, fortunately, it was not a big part of my practice. Um, it was one of the more financially lucrative, I would say. But I could turn to title work, which is boring. Most attorneys don't like doing it, but I could do it with a completely clear conscience. You're
Yeah.
just title work is very similar to what I was doing with the early church. You're trying to find out the truth, who owns a tract of land. And you don't care as a title attorney, and you don't even start off with an assumption. You start off, I was in Texas at the time, so I'd start off with the state of Texas when they owned the land, or even when Mexico owned it, and then just trace it forward, will by will, deed by deed, up to the present day, and then, oh, this is who owns it. And then I could do with a clear conscience. And so, yeah, so that was, I turned to just doing title work, which I had done, a good bit as an oil and gas attorney, and I
Yeah.
just started doing that exclusively. It wasn't as exciting as the suing people, uh, but like I say, I just felt like, yeah, I want to live like they did, and not that I've achieved that, but I was just amazed. As I said, the Sermon on the Mount to them was not an ideal, an unreachable ideal. This was like, these are Christ's instructions of how we are supposed to live, and they did their best to live that. And so, yeah, I made that my goal in life to serve my Lord by taking his teachings literally. And um, so, yeah, we made a lot of changes in our life
Well,
as
can
a
David,
family.
can I
We did
ask
it.
you, is there
Go ahead.
maybe two or three things that you would say, um, through that some practices, some perspectives, I mean, clearly, your honor for the word, your honor for, God and his way is for someone to change what they're doing at their job and their practice a big deal. So I honor you for that. I would love just to hear a little bit deeper of a dive into that. So give me a couple of the things that you saw. I mean, you used the analogy of you were a well-respected Sunday school teacher where in comparison at that time you would have been seen as a, a backslidden heathen. So what are some of those if you know whatever you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, so I realized I was I was wanting to, get uh comfortable materially, be wealthy. I mean, that's why I went into law. It's a high-paying profession. I wanted to be well respected in the community as an attorney, people look up. Theoretically, they probably behind your back uh say more derogatory things, but um I realized I cared too much about those things.
Yeah.
Instead of, Jesus said, seek first the kingdom. And it's like, I don't have to work all these hours. Some people do. I mean, uh, a person needs to support their family. But as an attorney, I didn't need to work 40 hours for us to uh, be able to have our needs met. So one of the things I did, um, and this happened over a period of a number of years. I didn't just rush into, I'm going to just change everything. And I worked very closely with my wife and our two teenage children because I didn't want to lose them on the journey. I wanted to make
Yeah.
sure we were in it together.
That's great.
But um, so I cut back my work considerably. Eventually, I just started working part time,
Wow.
and I could do that as an attorney and support us. So that was, it's a major change that way. Um, we started homeschooling our children. Um, we were in a rural um, area. I mean, a small town in Texas in the Bible Belt. So thankfully, um, what was being taught in school wasn't too bad. It wasn't
Yeah.
like today,
Yeah.
but the children actually requested if they could homeschool. They had made a number of friends. And again, I'm not condemning someone whose children go to public school. Um, but yeah, we just felt like we would rather control what they're learning, have more um, input into that. So started homeschooling them. We made a lot of changes as far as entertainment. We uh, got rid of television. I mean, we still kept our television set where we could watch select videos. But I thought, why do I need the world just coming into my home all the time? I mean, the early Christians were trying to get away from the world, not by becoming monks out in the desert. They certainly engaged the world, but yeah, they didn't care for the world's entertainment, and that was one reason the pagans didn't like them is they wouldn't go to the Colosseum
Yeah.
and watch
The
that.
entertainment that everyone else was enjoying that they weren't a part of, and that really put a target on them.
Yeah. So I talked to the children about it, and we all agreed, yeah, we can live without network television. And the interesting thing, I forget who asked my teenage daughter, so yeah, how do you feel about all these changes, your family's doing, you've given up this and that and all that. And she said, oh, well, that's when life started getting fun,
Wow.
and um, one of the decisions I made was anything that I was going to ask the family to sacrifice, I would bring in something just as good or better to replace it. So if we got rid of television, they remember me after supper, often going back to the office and working late at night. So all of that ended. I was suddenly spending lots more time with the family. We were doing family outings every weekend, and so yeah, for them it was great. Dad was home now all the time. In fact, I eventually moved my office to my home and was able to work out of home, and so I was able to do most of the homeschooling of our son, and I did a lot of our daughters as well. And so that was a real joy being able to, teach my children, to have the time to do that, and then, to be with them all the time, throughout the day. So like I say, there were blessings, and we didn't really miss the things we gave up, but we wanted a much more Christ-centered life, not just giving part of our life to Christ, but really all of it. And again, anyone listening to this, I'm not saying that my journey has to be somebody else's. That,
Right.
um, but I would just say, I would encourage someone, to read some of these writings for yourself. Some of the ones I can mention that are pretty easy reading. None of them are real light, but some of the easier ones. Um, if you have the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and they're online,
Yeah.
um, of course, the Didache is very short and readable. There's a work called Letter to Diognetus, again, very short, very readable. Tertullian's Apology is just classic. It's quite readable. And then there's one by a man named Minucius Felix, not a well-known writer, but he has a debate between a pagan and a Christian, and it's just fascinating. It was written as an
Okay.
apologetic work, but it's probably the most engaging work of all the early Christians. Again, it's not real long, but in those, you just see what it meant to be a Christian back in those days. It wasn't a lot of theology. They were
Yeah.
not focused on theology. There were some basics that could not be compromised, but yeah, beyond that, it was a focus on how you lived your life.
Right.
And that's what impressed me. I saw all the theological issues, and I certainly took note of them, but the lifestyle is what impacted me the most.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of our conversation with David Bercot. We decided to ignore the time and go long and later release it in 3 episodes. So be sure to come back next week and listen to part 2. Be sure also to check out the links in the description for more of David's writing.
I'm not searching for some new truth. I'm just longing for the truth. You can't help but notice there's something missing. Would you help us get honest? Or would you help us get